Jacob, thank you for coming back to us to dive deep into the topic. And we're honored to have you back again. And if you guys are planning just to visit and leave, this is a small bribe to stay until the end. You may be eligible for the raffle. You will be eligible to win in the raffle or any of the mining products. We'll do it at the end before Jacob leaves. And then if you are first time with us, I hope you're going to come back again. We have various topics. Everybody's talking about generative AI and you know, like jumping on that bandwagon. We're not going to teach you how to do it. There's plenty of video out there. I became friends with Dave Shapiro, a book author, a couple books he wrote on natural language, cognitive architecture. And it's kind of more bigger picture where AI is going and how to kind of saddle the wild horse and bring humanity to a better place. So excited for that. We're firming up the date. And then back to our feature presenter. So thank you, Jacob. Please take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Daniel. I'll get started over here with the screen share. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Oh, I'll restart this just so that it gets pinned for everybody. Thanks everybody for coming. I know it's probably a lot of your lunch times if you're on Eastern time, or even if it's not, maybe it's kind of during your day trying to wrap up the week. I'll try not to call on anybody to answer any questions, but thank you for coming out. As I was mentioning just a little bit before, this is a subject that I find really interesting, approaching it from more of a data engineering perspective, because for a lot of people, it can feel as though it's pretty arbitrary. People are just designing data models in a way where the data model is kind of based on what the business needs, based on what people are describing as kind of the look and feel of what they need. What we want to do here, what I want to try to present is this framework, the BEAM framework, the business event analysis modeling framework, to help give it a bit more structure. You as an engineer coming from perhaps more of a software engineering, data engineering, whatever perspective, hopefully this framework is going to give you something that's a little bit more robust to depend on to be able to kind of take your first foray into doing data modeling. So another quick thing just before I dive in, I'm Jacob. I'm the practice lead of analytics engineering and data architecture at Montreal Analytics. Montreal Analytics also recently was acquired by a company called Datatonic. Datatonic now are partners in Europe. I'm actually in Europe, but it's the combination of kind of our European team, which has more ML experience than us, and our North American team, which is really kind of focused on the MDS. But if you see anything that's kind of Montreal Analytics, a Datatonic company, it's because we've joined forces together to have kind of a global force, or EMEA in Americas, at least Asia Pacific coming perhaps at some point. But great, let's dive into it. If you have any questions, let me know as we go through. But I've got this Miro board here that I'm going to go through just because there were a few diagrams that I wanted to kind of take from some other resources of ours. So I'll try to keep this to just about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, just so that it can kind of fit within a lunch hour. Feel free to drop questions if you have questions, and then I think we'll be able to stick around, if you're able to stick around, to just chat at the end if anybody has any questions, if you want to have a more unstructured conversation at the end. But as for the presentation, really this is my main objective. Data modeling and transformation is often ad hoc, and when it's not, it can feel really arbitrary. BEAM is just one example, but it's a great example of a methodology that can help give structure to how you design and iterate your data model. Today, I'm going to try to explain BEAM by first presenting a legacy approach, what some of the weaknesses are of that approach, and then talk about a BEAM approach and talk about whiteboarding, which is one of the first steps of the BEAM approach, talk about the BEAM canvas, talk about the BEAM event matrix, and then finally wrap up with going further and then open it off, kick it off with some questions. Okay, so what we need first before talking about this legacy approach is an example request. When we're talking about a data model, really the data model need is coming in when somebody has a request and they have an opinion that they want to impose on the data. We're not talking about some of those data engineering concepts of bringing data into the warehouse. The data is already in a warehouse or a database. We're at that last mile. We're now at kind of taking that data, taking that raw data and transforming it and modeling it so that our end user or stakeholder is able to get the results that they need, the analysis that they need. Here's an example request that we can use throughout this. we have an exec team at an organization, and they want to have a better way of unifying metrics for their different teams across the organization. They want a report that helps them understand user growth week over week, want to be able to slice the data by region too, so that they can compare across regions. And their idea is to have the following metrics: active user count, count of highly engaged users, count of churn risk users, average page view count, and they want it, of course, as soon as possible. This, hopefully, if you've worked at any kind of data-driven organization, this is at least somewhat familiar. Maybe it brings up good experiences where you've been able to adapt to it appropriately. Maybe it also brings up some more ad hoc experiences of saying, okay, let's write that query as quickly as we can. Let's write that transformation as quickly as we can. So really our question here is, how would you respond to this without a data model? Before jumping into that with the legacy approach, wanted to even just leave a couple of sticky notes, a few sticky notes on the right that help start hinting at the problems with this type of approach, and especially responding to this approach in an ad hoc way. Great, that's their approach, but how do you define an active user? Or how do you identify churn risk users? What's the definition of that precisely? How do you identify, conversely, a highly engaged user? And what if they want to slice this by something else in the future? They say region today, but how can we structure the data so that if they modify that need, we can adapt to it more easily, as opposed to just creating something that's report specific? Okay, so spending all of those, let's dive into an example of how somebody might respond to that. So over here, we have a stored procedure, kind of a create table as select style statement. I'll be able to dig into it in a little bit. I know that it's a bit small, perhaps, just from the screen that you're looking at. But this is just meant to be an example. This is really common in terms of how people are responding to these types of requests, because it fits that request perfectly. It's really responding to the needs of that request. Let's kind of walk through what that legacy approach is. Legacy approach here is build that report to the spec. You have a specification and you build the report to it. No need to think about any other complexity between the report that you're trying to build and the data that you have. How can I connect those two dots? You're also naturally going to name columns to fit your reporting case. You're doing this in an ad hoc way. You're doing it to respond to that spec. And perhaps you're manually validating this with the stakeholder. This is all hopefully sounding like a lot of work. It's the effort is high for every single report that you're creating here. What we're seeing and what I'm trying to highlight here is just there's nothing in between. There's no middle layer, there's no meta layer. There's nothing that's going to sit between to make this analysis easier. You're doing it in an ad hoc way every time. What are some of the issues? What are some of the outcomes that come from that? There's definitely a maintenance burden. This is also generally untested. When you're creating files like this, we talked about the manual stakeholder validation, and this is where I can kind of dive into some of these parts. What if we have a definition like this for is highly engaged? How are you actually going to go about testing that? If you have this definition of is highly engaged, sure, you can test the end result of it and say how many highly engaged users do we have, but how can you test it in perhaps more of a unit test style way? It's not going to be easy because it's baked into the middle of the query. If you could pull it out into its own UDF, if you could pull it out into its own function, into something that's a bit more modular and something where it's getting surfaced right away, as opposed to in some sort of aggregated model, it's going to be easier to test. It's going to be more isolated. Testing is going to be a challenge here. Going to these other outcomes, we can also see it's opaque, difficult to understand those metrics. So that one there, this is highly engaged, and it's kind of its counterpart is churn risk. These two, you can kind of understand them better if you see them both together. But the problem of this type of query is they're wrapped up in a stored procedure, or they're wrapped up in a create table as select statement. There's no easy way for somebody to investigate that and find that and apply it to another analysis or easily understand what's going on. It's wrapped up into that SQL model. It's wrapped up into a specific report. It's not as though it's a business concept now. It's not as though churn risk is applicable more broadly. It's trapped within a single report. Over here as well, inefficient SQL, and then the big one, not analytically flexible. In terms of inefficient SQL, this we could also talk about. The main thing that I kind of liked about this use case is it's not incremental. There's not a lot of these optimizations that you would normally want to do when you're creating potentially a long table like this, potentially a fact style table like this. It's really not optimized, and it's not easy to optimize. It's not easily optimized. It's all wrapped up into the same file. What that means is for us to go in and to make more of these modifications to try to improve it, we're working on a monolith. It's not as though we have the component parts. The last one, and kind of the big one in here, is it's not analytically flexible. And not analytically flexible, I really want to highlight this, and this is just an example that I've kind of adapted here, is that it's set to a granularity of a date, week, and the region. So it's set to a specific week and it's set to a specific region. This is going to be quick to query because it's creating the table in your database. But if I want to modify that time frame from date week to date day to date month to any other date part, and if I want to change the slicer from region to city, or if I want to change it to region and subscription type, I'm not going to be able to do that with that table. And what I would have preferred to have is something that's at kind of a finer grain. Here, it's one record per week, per region. However, what we had just earlier here was actually some pretty useful CTEs where this one up here was defining it as an active user set at the grain of the user, region, and date day. You could simplify this and just say it's the user and the date day. You would have one record for every user and day, but we lose that analytical flexibility. We lose that grain by making it coarser and rolling it up into a definition like what we see at the bottom, just like this date, week, region. So this, just as an example, is trying to illustrate, and hopefully in a way that's perhaps familiar to some sort of procedures, some create table as select statements that you've seen if you've worked with any of this type of data engineering work, to something that's report driven and hard to maintain. You write this, it works for the stakeholder, they're happy, but you're worried about how much work it's actually going to take for you to maintain this into the future. What we're going to talk about today is Beam. And Beam is a way for us to get that data model, to have something that can sit in between, and to have ultimately a dimensional model that will help make all of those analyses easier. In the last example, we jumped straight from what the request was and the raw data to the report with nothing in the middle. What we're talking about here, and what I talked about in the last presentation with Serverless Toronto, was around the idea of how data modeling and modeling a fact can make it easier and more flexible for analyses after. One thing that's missing with that is how to do that, how to design that model, in an effective way. Beam, once again, as I was saying before, is just one example. It's one framework for designing that model, but it's a really effective one. And I'm going to try to show you the first part of it today. We only have so much time. I can't show you all of the details, but I'll be able to at least help with the first half. So Beam, a few things about Beam. Beam stands for Business Event Analysis Modeling. It's often stylized with this star at the end, this 6-point star. The 6-point star, this is kind of foreshadowing for what we're going to cover, is actually 6 points with the center kind of representing their 7 W's. The 7 W's, they all have a W in them. Some of them start with W. But these are the 7 questions or the 7 kind of words that would begin a question that you can use to better understand your data and to help design the data model. Beam itself includes a variety of things. It includes a variety of different tools, 3 of which we're going to be talking about today: the Beam Whiteboard, the Beam Canvas, and the Beam Event Matrix. There's a few other things that I'll kind of hint at with going further, but we're going to use these to help us get to, and this is kind of more in the technical terms for it, we're going to get from the raw data to a logical data model. We're not going to get to the physical data model. We're not going to get into the SQL for how these tables would actually be materialized, but we're going to go from that raw data to the conceptual model, which is how the business sees itself in the broadest sense, into the logical model, which is what are the tables going to need to be without having the details of these are actually the columns, this is the SQL that is going to produce the physical model. This kind of process of going from conceptual to logical to physical is a great way for us to help standardize that movement. Beam is proposed originally in this book, the Agile Data Warehouse Design book, written by Lawrence Core and Jim Stagnito. And in this book, Lawrence and Jim, they introduce the methodology, and it's by far the best resource for you if you want to be implementing this with your own team at your own organization. It's a great read for experienced data modelers who have had some of those issues of kind of designing things perhaps in a more waterfall way, and they want to figure out how to do this in a more agile way. And it's also really great for new data modelers, people that are new to data modeling as well. Lawrence, he also, so Lawrence wrote that book, and Jim Stagnito is his second author, but Lawrence also does public trainings and private trainings for the Beam approach. a couple of people actually on our team at Montreal Analytics, Datatonic, have done one of those trainings a few years back in 2020. Really great way to kind of cement some of those learnings. He does those private trainings for companies specifically. He also does those public trainings. I believe he'll have some public trainings coming up later this year. If that's interesting for you or your team, definitely check it out. He's a great teacher, great author, and has a very useful framework for designing data models. So let's get into it, and let's get into these 3 tools of Beam and how we can apply them to help design a dimensional data model. So earlier I hinted, and the foreshadowing was there was that 7-point star, or the 6-point star with a center. We're going to use those 7 questions in a methodical way to design our data model. What we're going to do to begin with is whiteboarding. I called this a tool, and it's much more of a process within Beam, just because it doesn't have the same template as the second 2 tools. But whiteboarding is where we need to start. Whiteboarding really comes in these 2 steps. The first step is where we want to start asking our stakeholders questions about how they use data, and we want to try to make those questions as specific as possible. So earlier we saw that we had a request that was coming in. What we want to do is try to get away from just that report, try to get away from just that single use case, and bring our stakeholders together to do a whiteboarding session, or sometimes it's multiple whiteboarding sessions, depending on the size of your team, to ask them, what questions are you asking about your data? And if possible, let's start at the middle of that star. Let's start at the how many, the number questions that you're asking about your data. These examples that we have across the top are just a few ways that you might respond and that are tailored to the use case that we saw before. Here, we're really trying to start in the middle. No need to be too strict about that. If people start giving you different answers that are not really about numbers, also record those. But what we're doing in this first step is trying to capture that information, try to capture that language of how they see their data and what numbers they're most interested in. I'll go through these examples and then I'll kind of come back to that caveat that I was talking about. So let's start with the far right with exec, just because exec is as close to the stored procedure that we saw before. The exec team is interested in ultimately the volume of users. They're interested in how many more users do we have this week than last, how many are active, highly engaged, or churn risk, and then that other kind of subpoint to it, which was how many pages are our users interacting with in an average week. Okay, all 3 of those, nice and simple, quantitative. We can kind of see how that would be a number that we're going to be calculating with our data model, and we can see that there's definitely some of those other 6 W's that are going to surround those numbers. But as we bring other people to the table, and if you remember, and I'll zoom out just to our complex definition of churn risk, there's a few other things that are in here. So charges, social shares, reviews, things like that. So let's get back over here and see what the operations team was thinking about as well. Operations, unlike exec, is much more narrow in their focus. Operations is curious about tickets. Operations doesn't care about the revenue. They're not concerned with all of these kind of broad definitions. They're just concerned with those support tickets. Support tickets, we actually, we missed it. It was in the churn risk definition. I was looking at the one for highly engaged, but it was a part of that sub definition. How long do tickets take to close is one of their first questions. And then how many support tickets are being opened and closed? They're really interested in throughput and they're interested in efficiency. Finance, and now to go through these ones maybe a bit more quickly, how many charges fail per week? How much revenue is at risk of churning? How much revenue are we making? Okay, we're starting to see some things might be interconnected. We can see that there's perhaps that core understanding revenue and then at risk of churning. Okay, at risk of churning is perhaps the slicer or perhaps the grouping by which we would understand the revenue. Lastly, product, what proportion of our revenue, what proportion of our reviews are positive? How many positive reviews are we receiving? What proportion of our users are writing reviews? This one kind of threw us a bit of a curveball because the questions are actually phrased as what proportion as opposed to how many as we saw before. This, don't get too distracted by it. It's just another way of thinking about one of those number responses. What proportion is also to say how many, but in a percentage or in a fraction. These are still trying to get at that center, trying to understand the numbers. In this first step, we're trying to capture all of the questions that have a response that is a piece of quantitative information that's responding to that how many question. In addition to these questions, you may also have broader questions, and those questions may have a bit more kind of the philosophical nature to them. When you're going through whiteboarding, what we recommend is just to try to press further. So if somebody says, I want to understand the drivers of growth, or I want to understand how to more efficiently spend our marketing spend, those are interesting questions. How to do this more efficiently? What are the drivers? But if you can ask more of the component parts and say, what are we looking at within that? Spend is a little bit easier. You would be able to say, how much are we spending and what is our marginal benefit to spending? But what we really want to understand with this whiteboarding step, and what you need to do as a good beam modeler, is just ask those follow-up questions to try to get to those how many questions first. How many, how much, what percentage, what fraction? You're trying to find all of these numerical questions, all of these questions with number answers. That's our first step of whiteboarding. Whiteboarding is then going to lead us into a star schema, ultimately into a dimensional model. And how we're going to do that is by taking these sources of numerical information and naming them as event stories. So let's start with a nice simple example with finance. Finance is talking about charges, and they're talking about revenue. So charges, where are charges coming from? Well, a charge in the story that's occurring is when a user is charged. A user charges their credit card. This user charging a credit card could be successful or it could be unsuccessful. Up here, it's indicated that there are different failures that may occur. So perhaps there's actually two different things that are going. User charges a credit card, or ultimately the user may pay an invoice. These are two stories. What we're trying to do is now take that quantitative piece of information and associate it with the thing, with the timestamp, with the verb that captured that information, with the event where that information was recorded. In addition to this, we can see reviews. User reviewing an app is really going to help with product. User opening a support ticket, that's also going to help with operations. And then user viewing a page, that's going to be really directly related to exec. Exec is also going to depend on some of those other ones. What I'm trying to draw the connection here is we've asked questions about how many, we've asked questions about quantitative information. Now what we're trying to do is associate that with specific timestamps, with specific actions that are producing those metrics, that are producing those recordings. One thing, though, that we haven't talked about, especially with these specific timestamps, is when somebody describes something that is an event, but is not associated with a specific timestamp. The two on the far left are two examples of evolving events. So here we have our discrete events, discrete with a single timestamp. And on the far left, we have two evolving events. A user is active on the app, a user has a session. This is clearly an event. We can see that this is clearly something that happened. There are a bunch of associated recordings and measurements with it, but it's evolving because there are multiple timestamps that help explain that session, that explain them being active. User having a session is quite similar to a user buying an item, buying a product. When you buy a product, there is the moment of buying the product, but then there's also the life cycle of shipping the product, ultimately having the product delivered, potentially returning the product, and potentially ultimately getting your refund for that product. That evolving event, it's very important. If you remember from the last talk, this is hopefully making you think about accumulating snapshot facts. This is something that is also a great opportunity for us to model, and we want to highlight that. So in this whiteboarding, and not to kind of go into all of the details, I'll move on for now. What we've done is we've tried to ask those questions about how many, bring it down into the events that are capturing those pieces of information, the events through which that information is recorded. And now we have the center of our different events that we'll be able to discuss. So whiteboarding helps us identify the centers. Here we were just talking about one example. We were just talking about this kind of user activity, this users being active flow. You might also do whiteboarding sessions for other parts of the business. That user activity is one thing, but maybe you need to go deeper on invoicing, and you need to think about the teams that are getting involved in invoicing. Use this whiteboarding example just as one example of how you might whiteboard for that business process, and know that you could do it for some other business processes. For the sake of time, we're going to keep going with this one example and take our user activity, take our user sessions, and use our next tool. So our first tool, not much of a tool, it's more of a process. Our second tool is much more of a tool. We have our how many points, and we're going to put them in the center of our canvas. Now we're going to go through the process of asking our other 6 W questions to fill in the blanks and to fill in the rest of the information. So in here, just to kind of show how this is translating, and hopefully you can start seeing how our process is starting to create this conceptual model, starting to create this logical model. We can see all of those pieces of information now populating how many. We can see a number of active users, a number of reviews, number of charges, pages viewed, support tickets. Also some things that are just named metrics. Revenue. Okay, revenue might be a bit more complex. It may be the price net of tax, net of anything else that may be excluded, net of refunds, net of cancellations. We also have a review score, and then we also have a duration in here, time to close a ticket. So these are just a few of our examples of how many questions. If we had done more whiteboarding, maybe more of them would have come up. These sit at the center of a Beam canvas, and this Beam canvas has been scoped to our user session. So it's been scoped to the idea of an evolving event. You could also scope it to just one of your discrete events. It would make this canvas simpler. But our user session, just because we know that some people are interested in these things, such as number of active users, we're going to keep it scoped to a larger evolving event so that we can accommodate all of our different stakeholders. We'll come back to the options between discrete and evolving using our next tool. Here we have all of those numbers, and what we now need to ask is, when you're talking about those numbers, what does the rest of your question look like? When you say, I want to know how many active users, by what, or when, or where? What are the different filters or groupings that you're going to be using? Filters and groupings to make you think about the SQL, but what are the other clauses in your question to help further explain your analysis? If I'm saying, I want to know how many active users by region, but for the past 30 days, what does that mean exactly? Maybe what I'm saying is I want to know the number of active users by the IP region, by our best guess at what their region is based on their IP, for those that were active, or perhaps for those users who were registered within the past 90 days. Asking these questions, what you're meant to do, or what your role as the Beam modeler, the person running the Beam process, is to ask those detailed questions. So if somebody says by region, ask them, what do they mean by region? How are we finding out what region? They're saying, oh, the region that we capture from their IP address. If they say for the past 90 days, you need to follow up with the question of past 90 days according to what? According to what timestamp? Then as people start adding more information, they might say, I want to know active users by their activity type. Here you can start asking those questions of what are those activity types and how do you define them? Highly engaged and churn risk. What you're trying to understand is just the business meaning of these terms, and you're trying to populate the rest of this canvas with those terms. You might also say, I want to know the review scores, or sorry, I want to know time to close a ticket. And the follow-up question to that is kind of how, like what's the rest of the context of the support ticket? Within the support ticket, there may be a lot more information. Perhaps some of it is falling into what and why, such as the reason for opening up the support ticket. What we're trying to do is capture some of that information around this canvas. You'll start seeing some information that is connected in different areas. We'll see the user, but then we'll also see when they're first registered, when they're potentially churned, what their billing address is. That's all by design. We want to use this canvas so that we can capture all of that information, have it start surrounding the core of our canvas so that we can start better understanding what all of these slicers are, what all of these potential filters are. In your Beam process, you're going to do your whiteboarding potentially in one session, and then bring together all of the people that are relevant for one of those events to fill in this canvas. And you want to be as exhaustive as you can with filling in this canvas so that you can identify, yes, at the center we have our fact, but what are all of these different pieces of information that surround it? So as I was mentioning with that, user is something that occurs in multiple places. There are also a couple of things that also might occur in multiple places, such as the support ticket. We use that information now to summarize it within an event matrix. So this is our third tool, the third and final tool of the Beam tooling that I'm going to cover, and then I'll talk about kind of where we go next with this. This is what we translate our Beam canvas or canvases into. So this event matrix, I showed a similar event matrix to this in the other talk. We kind of jumped into it without all of the pre-work, but this is a way for us to translate what has just been discussion into what is approaching a logical model for our database, and what becomes a prioritizable model for what we're going to put on our database, on our data warehouse. So let's start with our y-axis to begin with. User sessions, page visited, charge attempted, ticket opened, review submitted, and then lastly, weekly active users. These are just a few of the examples for how we could represent these metrics, these bits of quantitative information across different fact tables. This is leveraging the Kimball concept of different fact types: transactional facts, accumulating snapshot facts, periodic snapshot facts. There's a few other ones, but currently we're just taking those three. And these are three ways that we can represent it. The first two, accumulating snapshot fact and transactional fact, were originally surfaced before, when we were talking about the idea of a discrete event or an evolving event. Now that we can see it down here, we can actually see kind of the value of using each one. With charge attempt, for example, it may have a many to one relationship with a user session. You may be able to do multiple charges within a user session. Same thing with pages visited. You may be viewing many different pages within a session, or a session could just be one page view. Ticket opened, hopefully you're only opening one ticket. Review submitted, same kind of thing. Hopefully it's just one review. What we can see there now is there's different kind of relationship in terms of the magnitude of these events. Some of these tables are going to be longer than other tables. However, one thing that we want to notice is what metrics are going to be calculable on which tables. User session, as we saw before, is now going to be able to have a field, or it's going to be associable with something like an activity type. You're going to be able to know that bit of information about the user session. The page visited is going to be more granular than that, but from one page visited record, you're not going to be able to know if that person is a churn risk or a highly engaged unless you get that from another table. From this, from listing these here, we can then start associating it with the points around our canvas. So we capture that information. We listed those just as options across our y-axis. Now across our x, what we're going to do is do that work that we were just doing with our canvas of grouping these reasons together into their dimensional groupings, into their business object groupings, a user, a support ticket, and we're going to expose them down below. Here we have a user, support agent, subscription, page. If we did more canvassing, if we did more whiteboarding, we might also have more metrics more dimensions to run across the top. These are the points around the star where our dimensions are going to be captured. So within the user, we have all of the attributes of the user. Within the support agent, we have all of the attributes of the support agent. And this is how we're going to better explain those different facts. Here, we can also see what is related to which different types of facts. Our user session has a lot of different potential joins. There's the user that is going to help explain the user session. There's the support agent and the subscription. All of these you can start imagining in your BI tool are going to allow you to do more analysis. If you have a question about, amount of activity by subscription type, or the amount of activity that a certain support agent was responding to, these are going to be questions that you'll be able to respond to if you implement the user session and those dimensions. In contrast to that, if you have something that's much more granular, such as a ticket opened is going to be perhaps more useful than a user session, especially if more than one ticket was opened in a user session. And it's going to be associable with the user and the support agent. This, however, is not going to have all of the same detail about the page visited, the charge attempted, or the review submitted. Once we fill in this information, and this is just the information for one beam canvas, we can start filling in some of these additional columns. Impact, effort, and priority are things that we would then do in an event matrix review. So we've done our canvas, we've filled in our x-axis and our y-axis, and what we're now going to do is come back together to find out what we should do with this and how we should prioritize the implementation of this model. This is pretty high level. It's pretty simplified too, just because we're only working with one beam canvas. But what we could do is, based on those how many metrics and those quantitative bits of information, we can go through and prioritize the impact, the analytical impact of each one of these different fact options. For weekly active users and user sessions, they can have those key bits of information about churn risk and about highly engaged. Therefore, perhaps both of those to us are an impact of 100. Then as we go through the other ones, we can start seeing, okay, it's not everybody who's interested. It's just perhaps the operations team, or it's just the product team. what you can do, and there's different ways that you can kind of calculate or estimate these impact scores. You can start assigning, based on the stakeholders that are there, the value that you associate with the impact of having that table. The operations team may really like having a ticket open table because it's as granular as possible. It's really specific to their use case. They may say this is really high impact for us, but if it has no impact for the other team, ultimately you as the team that's prioritizing that, you need to take that into account, saying it's a low impact table. Effort, same kind of thing, but this is more looking at your technical team after they've done some data profiling. I'm not going to talk about data profiling too much today, just I don't have a strong enough example to kind of bring it in, and it often takes a bit more time, but that's taking this model and saying, how complex is it going to be for us to create a user sessions table? How high quality is the data? How much data cleaning are you going to have to do? Even conversely, how complex is it going to be for you to create a user dimension table? How high quality is the data? Do you have to kind of reconcile users from various different sources to have that single unified dimension? How complex is that going to be? Here you can start indicating effort. 80 for a user session, it involves a lot of different sub-elements, in contrast to something like a 10 for a page view. It's just the page view. There's only one source of data perhaps for it. It's going to be relatively simple to expose. From here, we generally work with a t-shirt sizing approach for priority. And this is just to say, okay, high, medium, low, high, medium, low, as opposed to t-shirt sizing. This is a way for us to take those impact and effort and translate it into something that is going to allow us to plan a sprint, work in an agile way to ultimately implement this data model. This, as I was mentioning, is just one example of one whiteboarding session, one beam canvas, and one event matrix. Especially at this part here, it's going to be a little bit weaker of a sprint planning because we only have that one. Generally, in a beam process, you're going to speak with your stakeholders more thoroughly and also do canvassing for some other use cases. Instead of rushing through this in 45 minutes, you would have a few other canvases that help you understand invoicing, that help you understand the activity on your app, that help you understand the activity that fully surrounds product reviews or support tickets. From there, you're going to have a longer y-axis. Hopefully, you're going to have a better understanding of which dimensions are most important. And this is going to help really kick it off for your sprint planning to understand, okay, this is the most valuable fact for us to first implement. Once we have that fact, we know that the user is the most commonly conformed dimension. And from there, it really is giving you the steps in the direction to start implementing this incrementally. This event matrix is also something that's meant to be living. So as you have new business processes, as you have new dimensions, as your business model slightly changes, you should be able to come back to your canvases. You should be able to come back to your event matrix, modify it as needed, expand it as needed, and come back to the prioritization to figure out what you need to implement next or refactor. These tools, and I'm only giving you the kind of cursory introduction to them, these three tools are meant to help you go from having no structure to having a sense of what that center of your 6-point star is, to knowing what some of those points surrounding it are, to finally translating that into a star schema or set of star schemas. Okay, pretty high level run through of that. Hopefully you can start seeing that it's giving you a bit more structure to how you would be creating a dimensional model. It's not just all look and feel. It's not just trying to say what ought to be on this table, what ought to be on that table. These questions are meant to capture information and then start associating it with where it needs to live. However, as I've been mentioning, this is just scratching the surface. So this is only starting to give you some information about what Beam can do, but it's a whole book. Within the rest of the book, you have a ton of these other subjects. I'll try to speak to them briefly, and then we can get into some questions soon. But there's all of these other elements that will take you from what we saw here, which is our logical model. You can see, okay, if I was going to prioritize creating a user sessions table, a weekly active users table, and then one table per dimension. Okay, so I have 6 tables, but what do they physically look like? What are my surrogate keys going to be? How am I going to maintain these tables? Am I going to be using stored procedures for this? Am I going to be using DBT? Am I going to be using sequences for my IDs? What are all of those details? We haven't gotten there. Some of these sticky notes are going to help us get from that logical model to the physical model. So a few of the things, really just to go through these quite quickly. Conforming dimensions. This is another thing to look into if you want to learn more about kind of building a dimensional model, building a high quality dimensional model. Conforming dimensions refers to the process of taking a dimension, such as a user, and trying to make it as rich as possible and conformed as possible to a variety of different use cases. Conform it to your invoicing, conform it to your activity, conform it to your support tickets, so that that single users table is multi-purpose and rich enough to help with all of those different analyses. Cost and performance optimization, that's really important as you're thinking about creating the physical model. How do you actually create these tables and maintain these tables? These aren't just tables that you make and leave. You have to maintain them. You have to think about what's the best way of maintaining those generally incrementally, and how to also respond to data quality issues with them. Dimensional hierarchies. We didn't talk about any of these complex use cases, but what if you have something like an employee and you want to know who the employee is, but you want to know who their manager is? Now you have an employee who is managing another employee, and potentially a complex hierarchy of how you're going to try to understand who somebody's manager is or who somebody's manager's manager is. Dimensional hierarchies, I think there's like a whole chapter or a whole half of a chapter that's dedicated to this, but this is a complex subject within Kimball and within the Agile data warehousing book. Time and date dimensions, this as well. Times and dates, there are a lot of different ways of representing them, and that can take up a lot of storage, and it can also add a lot of bloat to some of your facts if you keep all of those different formats there. This can be really key to just making it usable. Time and date dimensions have different strong suits and different use cases, so it's important to properly understand them. Dimensional histories and slowly changing dimensions. Really complicated one. This has to do with bits of information that may change about a certain dimension. A user's state can change. Somebody can move from one state to another. And how does that affect your facts? If you have, just to go back, because this one is pretty interesting. If you have something like a page visited, do you need to know the state of when they visited the page, or do you just want to know the most recent state? Slowly changing dimensions, really can't get into it. We don't have enough time to talk about it. But if you're not familiar with this, this is definitely something that I highly recommend reading up on, because it's one of the things that can really make or break a good dimensional model. I'll just mention these in a sentence for a few of these so that we can dive into a discussion. But degenerate dimensions is the process of identifying if a dimension should be its own table, or if exceptionally, you should just let it live on the fact. Our state example could actually be a good example of that. If you have a degenerate dimension that's captured at that moment, in certain cases, it may not be a bad idea to have it live on the fact, but there's a lot of complexity to that. Data profiling, spoke about that earlier. That's the process of verifying that your raw physical data will actually accommodate this data model, and what work you're going to have to do to make it accommodate that data model. Sprint planning and estimation, how are you going to run your data team? Are you going to be able to run it in a purely agile way? What is that going to look like? What agile principles are you going to follow? Tooling and implementation frameworks, talked about this with, are you going to use something like dbt? Are you going to use something like stored procedures? Are you going to use any of these other potential frameworks for representing your transformations? When it comes to translating your logical model into a physical model, that's also a complex challenge. Column naming conventions, just another one of these problems that you're going to want to think about early to help your stakeholders as much as possible when it comes time to start analyzing the data. Okay, so that last one there is just going to be for questions. If we zoom out, and I'll be able to share this with you, and I really recommend checking out the book. This was just kind of a quick crash course of taking a bad starting point, taking a stored procedure that was going to be hard to maintain. If this was delivered, you're going to be worrying that if somebody has a follow-up question, it's going to be hard for you to fix it, hard for you to debug. What we're proposing now is a dimensional model to sit in between that raw data and the request for a report. Now, if it came to this question of, okay, I need to answer that question, how can I do that? You have a few options. You have a nice fine-grained user sessions table. You have a coarse weekly active users table. This table is going to be quite similar to that stored procedure, but fundamentally, we know that it's going to be supported by other fact tables. You know, this one alone is not going to work for a use case. But what I hope you come away with here is the understanding of, okay, there's some process that can help me design this data model. This data model is fundamentally going to save me some time in the long run. Okay, I swear that's it. I hope you have questions. I hope You can stick around for at least the next 10 minutes if you have some questions about data modeling, and I think we'll also stick around for a bit after that. But I hope it's given you a bit more structure for this. If you want to find the Agile data warehousing book, it's available as an ebook. It's also available on Amazon, but really recommend it for new and or experienced data modelers. On to the questions.
Well, thank you so much. This was amazing. So guys, feel free. Who's going to be the first brave soul? While you're getting the courage, I'm not into this framework, but there is 5 W's and 1 how methodology for interviewing business stakeholders. And for those old enough, there used to be Zachman's framework for enterprises. It also had a similar matrix. So it's really gluing 2 things together. So thank you.
Yeah, they're definitely, a lot of these frameworks are using kind of similar questions. And one of the nicest things about this book, and I find this very much so with a lot of the other books about dimensional modeling, I've picked up those books and I've used them as reference books. This is one of the few books that I actually read through front to back, because the way that the narrative was structured, the way that it was written, helped me go through everything. Back when I read it the first time for a few years ago, I really appreciated that it actually stitched everything together, and it wasn't just this piece of information, that piece of information. But yeah.
Ozan, you have a question?
Oh, okay, I'm filling the survey, and then I will ask some questions. Okay, so the major question, Jacob, I want to ask is that how it's different from the the traditional approach of Kimball dimensional modeling. Apart it structures the problem very quickly in a very easy manner. You can come up with the dimensions and facts. So can you differentiate a bit between
Yeah, definitely. And to clarify for that, so Beam is really trying to help, and right here, kind of as the subline to it. So Beam is trying to just be a process to help you design that dimensional model, to design that Kimball model. When you look at the Kimball book is really that textbook reference for. A good example is with slowly changing dimensions. What are the types of slowly changing dimensions and what are their attributes? One of the things that people often kind of worry about or complain about is, how do I design that? How do I go from all of my different data sources to a functioning Kimball dimensional model? Beam is a book. Agile Data Warehouse Design is actually the book that is trying to give you a framework for designing that Kimball dimensional model. Kimball, though, is the foundation. Kimball is the rules of the road. And what this is trying to do is say, hey, Kimball, although it's a relatively simple framework, it's complex to design, or it's complex to design well, and this is intended as a framework to make it more approachable.
Got it. Okay, I will read this book.
Yeah, definitely. Like, even just as an example with Kimball, so with those fact types, if you're reading the Kimball book and you're saying, okay, there's all of these different fact types, when am I supposed to use those different fact types? If you read this book, if you read the Agile Data Warehouse Design book, it's going to help give you a much better sense of what are the questions that you need to ask the stakeholder to get from them saying, this is the data that I need, this is what I need to do my job, this is what I need to do to understand if things are working, to figure out which one of those fact tables you should build. You may know the textbook definition of an accumulating snapshot fact, or a periodic snapshot fact, or a transactional fact, but one of the things that's missing is just how to go from those stakeholder comments and questions to which design tool, which design specification you should implement.
Got it.
Nice.
Thanks, Dick.
John has raised the hand. John, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things I've struggled with over the years, because I've been working in data warehouse for 20 years, is dealing with the stakeholders where you have a whiteboarding session and they get enthused in the whiteboarding session and then seem to forget that they still have to pay for all this stuff. So, and then they're all disappointed, like, well, hey, come on, we went through that session, saw this neat stuff that we came up with. It was like, well, yeah, when you want to pay for it, we'll build it. And And like, it's gotten to the point where I want to avoid whiteboarding sessions. It's just easier to like, no, let's just not do that, because they're just gonna all get, upset that, we can't build all the cool stuff that they want because, the budget is $1.50. How do you manage that?
Yeah, it's fundamentally it's fundamentally if the budget is very small, it's going to be hard to run the session in the first place. And one of the things, to its credit, that Lawrence, when he was writing this book, did to help with that is get away from the waterfall approach that was commonly used for designing Kimball style dimensional models. That was to say, let's design it perfectly, let's figure out the whole vision, and let's deliver it all as one so that you can get all of the value from your whiteboarding sessions. To your specific point, John, it's still not really solved, because you're going to open up all of these doors and say, like, look at all these things that are possible. But one of the things that comes from that, that hopefully is going to help make this a bit more incremental, is you have that whiteboarding session, and then you bring everybody back to do this prioritization to say, that's great, we talked all about that. We asked the follow-up questions to figure out what's possible. But now, the budget hits the road, we need to talk about what to do first. We don't have unlimited resources. I think in those situations that you're describing, John, when the resources are super limited, there's almost no winning. But if you can be realistic about it and say, we have finite resources, let's use this to work incrementally, it's starting to give you a few more tools, but it's always going to be tough if somebody's coming with I want it yesterday, I want all of this yesterday. It's always going to be hard to win with those folks.
Thanks.
I saw lots of thumbs up and agreement in the chat. And Gina, also, you want to speak up? You don't need to raise hand, you can just jump in.
Yeah, I know. I think, at least in my experience, being a little bit closer to the business, if you can tie something, a cost ask, you want to have the shiny new thing and it's going to cost, more than $1.50, what the budget is. If we can align that to what an actual return on investment is, I find that having those concrete and real conversations with the business tend to kind of loosen up the purse strings a little bit more, at least in my experience. So that's what I would recommend. I would say, hey, let's put like a rev ops or a number or a goal associated with what this is going to do for the business, and reverse engineer. Hey, if we can free up an X amount of additional funding, that would be great, because this is what we could do for it, and these are the accretive values to the business from not just a revenue perspective, but an analytics perspective as well. Even something you might be able to commercialize in our experience.
Definitely. Great point, Gino. And I think with this example, this is really talking about reporting. Most of these examples are just referring to, I'd like to know this information. But I think more and more, especially as companies are really focusing on profitability and making sure that they can associate ROI with infrastructure like data infrastructure, you may want to think about reporting as one pillar, but then also just task automation and thinking about, okay, operationally, how is data going to be used? If you can associate your data with an operational use case, this might be something like the churn risk kind of information that we were talking about. We want to identify churn risk users, and we want to try to re-engage them to see if we can lower the amount of churn risk users and ultimately lower the amount of churn. That, when it becomes an operational workflow of saying, we identified this person as a churn risk user based on our data model, and then we sent them survey, we send them a promo code, we send them whatever it was. That kind of use of data, many teams that have well-functioning data models are able to do it. But it's, unfortunately, it's not always the first thing to come up, but it's people love seeing that kind of value, and it works really well with a dimensional model.
Vlas here. I have just a quick question. We call this now BEAM, but quite frankly, I mean, I've been in data warehouse business for 20 years, and there is not that many new things. We did use these similar matrices and interviews and everything. So, but basically my question is, this seems to be not only applicable to Agile implementation of the data warehouse, because of course we always need to prioritize, to define effort and so on. So basically, get down to what is my question. From your experience and on everyone that is on call, are you guys really building data warehouses using Agile approach? I have tried that and it didn't work quite well. And we did use, I would say, Beam approach, maybe modified Beam approach, but we didn't call it Beam. But all those 7 questions, interviews, whiteboardings, and everything. But it didn't work out in the Agile implementation when we have sprints that are 2 weeks long and so on. So, I mean, end user was quite disappointed. I have to be honest, even though we did get feedback relatively fast, but it was not as successful implementation.
Yeah. So to your first point, if you kind of exclude a couple of these, and you don't even have to exclude anything. You could use all of these same tools for planning out a waterfall style implementation of a data warehouse. You can go as exhaustively as you can. One of the nice things, and this is much better highlighted in the book, it's talking about how most of these different techniques can be done in an incremental way. So even what I was hinting at there with, you can come back and do a canvas for another subject, you can do another whiteboarding session for another subject. One of the nice parts of this is the push to work on things incrementally and to still be business oriented, to not frame something as a user if it's not a user, to say, okay, here's the business conception of a user. It's not just an application user. Working on things incrementally is always going to be hard. The book is really taking a lot of kind of pre-existing pieces and trying to rework them in a way to make Agile delivery easier. Not to say that it's going to be easy, but yeah, I think what you're saying there, kind of similar to some of the points as well earlier. It's very hard to deliver things incrementally. It's very hard to deliver that value in quick wins and quick ways. But hopefully by trying to use these techniques and by trying to have a framework, you can at least be delivering these understandings of where we're going, and then using tools like this to say, okay, we have to come together to come to some sort of agreement as to what we're building first. It's not to say that it's easy. It's definitely going to be hard to work on it in an Agile way. But the way that we do our work, just to maybe kind of bolster this with more of an example of how Montreal Analytics delivers on dimensional models, we kind of have to design them and work on them in an Agile way. We have some longer engagements, but we want to make sure that those engagements, just to be transparent with clients that we're working with, we want to make sure that we have those sprint goals. The sprint goals, especially when we're working with DBT, and DBT is going to allow us to work with things in a modular way. DBT being a SQL framework for creating kind of SQL models. Think of a model as like a table or a view that has metadata that connects it to another table or a view so that the lineage is understood. Fundamentally, when we're working with a client, we need to work on things in an incremental way. And we like the Agile approach because it helps us keep delivering value. That way we don't have to have an engagement where we say, here's your value, and then 3 months later, here's some more value. We like that this book, we like that the Agile process generally, we like that frameworks like DBT push us to deliver value in a more incremental way. This 2-week sprint, we're going to deliver user sessions. Next sprint, we're going to deliver the user dimension and the support agent dimension. The following sprint, we're going to go through another Canvas session to find out about invoices, etc. It's not perfect, but it has been working better for us than any of the other approaches that we've tried.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, bit of a long answer. I'm sorry about that, but hopefully just kind of like giving both sides to it helps kind of speak to what you were saying. It's not easy, but then also just to say it's not easy, but it's better than a lot of the other options that we've seen.
And I also want to say hi to Vlast. He's a friend of mine. I worked with him decades ago. One of the smartest database modelers I've ever worked with. My lifeline if you have difficult questions on SQL. So, Vlast, thank you for showing up.
No, fun. Thank you, Daniel.
So, but you brought a good point, like methodology-wise. When did you get clarity, Jacob? After reading the book, or after taking that course, or just after the few battles, like at work?
Sorry, wait. Can you reframe?
Yeah, when you were learning this framework. So now we're all motivated. We're here again to go deeper. like reading book obviously isn't enough. You recommended course at the beginning, and then joining company like yours for people to practice. When did you get clarity to say, aha?
Yeah, for me, I'm really thinking. So the first company that I was working with and kind of thinking about their data model on their warehouse, it was a great example of just something that was much more iterative and no planning process up front. That's okay. You know, that happens a lot of the time at startups where you're thinking about, okay, how can I adapt to this? How can I try to go from this reactive response to being proactive? We never got to the proactive space. So that as a starting point, I think was some of the most challenging data modeling. It wasn't really dimensional modeling. It was too ad hoc to even be called dimensional modeling. That's kind of where my starting point was for data modeling. From there, as I started learning more about Kimball, and then ultimately after I'd read this book and started applying more of this process, it was just that incremental process of getting a bit more process, getting a bit more frameworks to depend on, and just also a bit more legitimacy to say, this is not a simple process. We have to go through a few different steps for us to do this well. But in contrast, I find, you know, reading it and then applying it and practicing it is the best way for it to stick. It's not going to be easy for you to apply it in a quick kind of 2-week sense. That's why I think the course, the book, those are great ways to get exposure to it. But the thing that's going to follow up on that is if you can get this applied, maybe on a personal project, you'll want to make sure that you have enough data to kind of be able to properly tackle a personal project, and then you're going to have to role play as the stakeholders for yourself. But on the job learning, I think it makes the best data modelers. So these are resources, but the practice is really what helps cement it.
Thank you. I did ask this question because of worldly mapping. It's a beautiful approach when Simon talks about it, but I don't know anybody who can, you know, design upfront, predict the future. When you look back, oh, it's beautiful. We worldly map what happened, but we need things for the future. So that's why I was of last raised the kind of question. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And this and kind of like to one of the points that I was trying to mention at the beginning, like this type of work, or like this part of data engineering, this part of database work, I think it ends up being one of those, in contrast to talking about something like what's the most efficient way to load a table on Snowflake, or what's the most efficient way to, some of those technical subjects, those are always fun because then it's talking about a new technology. This is always a bit more challenging because it's talking about an age-old problem and just like small iterations on saying, hey, this worked a bit better than that way. This type of looser modeling, it doesn't feel as rooted in the technology. For me, yeah, practice has helped a ton. It's not always the easiest to kind of, you know, give people an aha moment of, oh, that's what I need to be doing. But the process, like slowly getting more process, slowly getting more tools, I think has really helped me. I hope it helps other people as well, as you read more books, as you get more experience with data modeling. But yeah, unfortunately, it's not as simple as me saying, hey, have you heard about the new feature on Snowflake, or have you heard about the, it's not as though that's gonna fix your data modeling woes.
Oh. Anybody else? We still have 20 minutes before we'll need to check out for the meetings, but we'll need 5 to 10 minutes for the Manning publications, Raffle. So do that as you're coming up with questions. And you can paste them here.
Okay, Jacob, will there be any upcoming, workshops or trainings, hands-on trainings where you give this, in more in hands-on approach?
Yeah, more hands-on. So especially for data modeling I think is really interesting. No plan for other future content around this. A lot of the stuff that I'm working on just kind of with my team more as my day job is more webinars and content that's around specific techniques, and that's also kind of why I was alluding to webinars that are around a certain feature and how to kind of get the benefit out of one thing that kind of we've been talking about a lot, and especially just from some of the data platforms that we like to work with, is the role of Python and Python getting used more and more for transformation in warehouse. Obviously, Python has been used for transformation a lot of the time in data science workflows, but thinking, okay, how can we get some of these people working in more Spark-like ways and PySpark like ways for their transformation? we have one webinar that's kind of in the works around that. That applies a few dimensional modeling techniques, but unfortunately, more in kind of what's upcoming on my radar. It's a bit more hands-on, a bit more technical, but I like that. I kind of like having a mix of the modeling stuff as well as the technical stuff. But for dimensional modeling, check out the courses that Lawrence puts on. I think he's probably going to have public ones this summer, is my guess.
And you know what I like? It's not sales pitch. Most of the presenters, when they introduce you, then you have to sign up for their course. You have nothing to sell, so much appreciated.
Yeah, for
but
this,
you should have Coursera or Pluralsight course. You're so good at this. So.
for this, like at least with this subject, I think just really to kind of synthesize what a lot of the questions have been around. It's like it's a shared challenge of anybody that's been doing data modeling work or data transformation work for any amount of time. So it's it's interesting to talk about because it is such a shared challenge, but it's also hard to talk about because if you only have 30 minutes, if you only have 45 minutes or a small presentation, you're trying to distill something. But these processes take weeks. These processes take a good amount of time.
Thank you. Next question. Anything?
Yeah, or any, like, even just curious to hear, especially like for data modeling, what type of platforms people are working on, what type of like, or are people generally modeling still on OLTP systems, or is it more, are most people modeling on warehouses? Just curious.
So I think last year on Azure, is it like that's where your company client is? I'm with BigQuery. I don't know.
Yeah. We are on Azure, so I'm currently on data warehouse side. So really not to OLTP. So and we are using dedicated pool Synapse as a target and different Azure services, Databricks, Sparks, and so on for the data factory, of course, and so on. And but still we use store procedures for main transformation work. So.
Yeah, and out of curiosity, so if you're using things like Databricks, are you using Databricks for significant amount of transformation? Are you kind of doing transformation as you're loading it into Synapse and then doing more transformation in warehouse?
Yeah, so we do. There are specific test use cases for which we use Databricks. It all depends on the where source data is, but we use that for just maybe 10% of the work, and just to load to the landing layer on the Synapse, and then from there we continue using store procedures. So it's kind of it all depends on the data sources. Somewhere we use ADLS as a storage layer, and so and now we are diving as well into lakehouse approaches, deltas. So that from the technology perspective, it's really moving so fast, and we are trying to keep up with it, and we don't always make the best decision, because you read about it and then, okay, let's try it, and then maybe it's still better to do it in the pure SQL. But it depends from case to case and on the data source.
Yeah, and when you're working with kind of an arsenal of multiple tools like that, especially when you get into the data modeling use cases, like Spark is really nice if you have a specific use case. Hey, we need to get these events transformed for a machine learning model or for a prediction. If you still have that dimensional use case where it's for analysis and you don't know what the analysis is going to be, SQL is still a great tool. There's a lot of those kind of, it's still probably going to be batch transformations. It's still probably going to be batch loading. Despite having all of these fancy tools, sometimes like SQL is still a great tool. Batch transformation still work really well.
Especially if you're good on like Blast on it. So if you get stuck with SQL, you know who to find. His name is here. So when we are talking about data ingest now, like I'm sucker for Fivetran. I don't have to think about it. Connected, they give me a schema at the end. it's no effort pipelines. What's your thought about that? I think your company was partnered with them too.
Yeah. Fivetran is especially for a lot of teams these days, especially like I think probably lots of people have experience with being on a relatively small data team or a relatively small data team for what your use case is. Fivetran is really nice because it helps you focus on a subset, and you can just really depend on Fivetran for properly accommodating all of those sources. That is also often a really easy sell for us to say, hey, instead of hiring the data engineer to support ingesting from Salesforce, for example, one of those really kind of challenging to customly ingest from, Fivetran works really well. There are some cases where you just have a massive volume of data, event streaming, anything like that, where it's going to depend on the platform. You know, if you're working with BigQuery, then you might be thinking, how can we just get that data into something like GCS to stage before ingesting into BigQuery? Snowflake, maybe similar kind of thing, like how to get that onto an external stage, as Snowflake calls it. So something like GCS or S3 before ingesting it. Synapse, Synapse I have by far the least experience with. I know that Data Factory is also one of those things that comes up when you're thinking about what's the best way of moving high volumes of data and at low latencies for Azure. But yeah, Fivetran, it's like, for a lot of people, Fivetran is going to work really well. It's going to be great for all of those use cases. And then when somebody says, but what about if I have a ton of data, or what if I have a really custom use case? Okay, then we can talk about some other technologies.
And you use Fivetran with the modeling you have here, because like it already comes with schemas pre-built connectors. I was lucky, maybe I was just setting up the views on top of different Fivetran connectors and exposing that to the visualization tools, which I'm not front-end guy. So how do you tie in Fivetran schemas, these connector-specific schema into this modeling?
Yeah, so a stack that we commonly work with is Fivetran, and then dbt for transformation, dbt being the templated SQL tool.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the nice things with Fivetran is, so if you're ingesting two sources with Fivetran, pretty simple. Views are probably going to be okay. You're going to be able to get away with most of it, and it's not a major concern. But if you have a client or something like that, and they have another business that they acquired, or they start working with another tool, and their number of sources starts increasing from 2 to 15 to 20, and they start having this wide kind of lake-like foundation to their data model, that's when a more modular data tool like dbt is going to help with the transformation. dbt works really well with BigQuery and with Snowflake. There's also Google's own data form tool, which is really similar to dbt, and it's more natively embedded into the GCP stack. So a lot of people end up working with that. But yeah, it's a question of scale. dbt is also nice because it has testing and documentation that you won't get if you're just working with views, or if you're just working with kind of your homegrown stored procedure solutions. But yeah,
and you pick it off from Fivetran, because Fivetran you can just lend the raw data or kick off the pipelines from Fivetran.
Yeah, Fivetran has some relatively new functionality for baking in dbt core with Fivetran. That's really interesting, especially for certain use cases. It's going to be tough if you're ingesting data from multiple sources, if it's not just Fivetran. dbt, though, the nice thing about dbt, with it being at the core just an open source technology, if you're comfortable with containers, you can just run a container and schedule it as you need to run your dbt transformations. That lets you also kind of
that's what
manage the cost.
Cloud Run.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's enough about me, but we have Ben from Segment here as well. So in the cases when you have reverse ETL, when you need more complicated things, have you used that product, Philly, about the company? Or what do you use for reverse ETL and CDP platforms? How do you go about that?
Yeah, Ben works at Segment, you said?
Yeah, Ben, you can say hi.
Segment I've used a lot, and like Segment 2 is kind of interesting because it helps with a few different use cases for ingestion to the warehouse, but then also some of the direct to tool syncing, kind of like reverse ETL without needing to do the ETL in the first place, like really the CDP use case. That, like, especially for marketing teams that are technical enough or can kind of like get the architectural vision to integrate one tool with the other tool, that's really nice. The fact that you can also ingest it into the warehouse is nice, because then you can do enrichment or transformation or cleaning or anything that you have to do. Yeah, Segment is a tool that I worked with it all the time at the last company that I was at. In the consulting work that I do now, I work less with event-driven architectures. So Segment is less common. It's kind of working more with APIs and a few other data sources. But yeah, lots of experience with Segment at the last job, actually.
Oh, thank you. Ben, you have anything to add?
No, not really. I think I guess the big excitement that we have in the Segment world is that we're delving further into that reverse ETL space. In the last few months, that's been our biggest launch is a case where we can start to take that profile that's been assembled in your Segment CDP and shift it back into the warehouse and make it available to all the other tools to share. So we're starting to delve more into the data warehouse partnership space.
Thank you. Any other questions, or are we going to move into the raffle? Did you do the survey? At least the name and email. Keep chatting while I prepare the raffle. So there's lots of knowledge in this forum.
Yeah, what are same kind of question, just out of curiosity, what are some other stacks that people are working with for warehouses, just to see, like, yeah, does it skew more Azure, or more and more people on tools like BigQuery and Snowflake? Are any people still, or are any people working with an OLTP system?
We're on an OLTP system. We're going from OLTP to Azure Snowflake DBT, and like a product iteration as well. So it's quite a leap for us, because we're going to leave the old product behind and move on to the new product, sort of thing.
Yeah, it definitely these days, I think migrations, like there's always people that are working on migrations, because tech debt is always that question of like, when do you have to pay it? But it's definitely a tough time in terms of people like wanting to focus on profitability, to focus on the ROI from different projects, and to still ask for something big like a migration.
Okay, so we are using Vertica as a data warehouse for a financial services company. So it's an on-premises, infrastructure, because it's a financial company. There are some regulations; they can't move their data on the cloud. So, and for the ETL tool, we are using Talent Open Studio. So yeah.
Yeah. With Talend, do you do the transformation with Talend as well, or?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and I haven't worked with Talend in a little while. How do you find kind of the configuration of Talend? Like for the transformation, is it done in code? Like how? Yeah. Just as one of the complaints that I've heard about it, where it's not always the easiest to kind of scale the transformation.
No, you can give that. There are built-in modules. You can use that to do the configuration and connect to your source.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of a you can say like a Fivetran low-code tool. You just need to know SQL. Also, you can do the orchestration part as well.
There's definitely, I think, like that push to some of these tools where it was no code. I think increasingly they're seeing the benefit of having some of these kind of low code options, or some of these further configurable options, just because if it really is no code and you have, you're going to potentially need an API if you have a large client, if you have a large use case. With Talend, not a tool that I'm super familiar with, but it makes sense that it's kind of some is no code, other parts low code.
Well, you can code if you know the Java, because Talend is a Java-based platform. It's a tool. So if you need some advanced functionality, you can also do customization if you know the Java.
Cool. So I used the time while you were chatting to paste the names of the people who didn't do the survey that are still on the call. So I will share the screen, and I want to wish you good luck. So any of the mining products you're eligible for. You don't have to do the books. They have courses. So Yeah, maybe you can prepare something for them. Let's see. A bill of names. So I hope I have everybody's name here. Is there anybody who is on the call whose name I'm missing? No? Okay, good luck. Oh my.
You should spin it again.
Why? You don't have time to study?
No, it feels more fair if you.
No, but you're the guest as well. Like, plus you're doing the extra work teaching us. I'm fine giving you the prize. Like, how do others feel? Like, it's normal. We give it to present. Yes. Okay, Jake. Yes. So
Well deserved. Yeah.
okay, so we'll be in touch, Jacob, at least to give you this prize and introduce you to nice manifolds. Maybe decide to write a vocal course for them. Who knows? So I want to thank everyone for coming today. This was really nice, and it's not easy to find time in busy schedules for lunch breaks, but you're in Europe, there was no other way to do it. Any other closing thoughts?
I'll be back in North American time zones next month. So
yeah. And feel free to share any courses, anything you publish, like you have an audience here, so we'll reshare in the groups.
Yeah, and connect on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is definitely where, in terms of like learning resources, I find it's easiest to kind of share and follow along with other people. So definitely, if you're interested in learning more, I try to post things there when I can. So definitely connect if that's of interest.
Thank you. You can go. Enjoy the weekend.
Bye, everybody.
Ciao. Ciao.
Bye. Thank you very much. Bye.
All right, guys. Thanks. Appreciate it.